Nika Kabiri, welcome to the show, Listening with Leaders. You are the founder of Your Next Decision, which can be found at yournextdecision.com. Thanks for taking out the time to talk with me and my audience.
Thanks for having me.
So we were just talking before we got on. We both have something very much in common in that we both teach decision making. And
Right.
as I told you, I teach a graduate course at Pepperdine School of Law. Tell us about your work as a decision maker and a student of decision making, and how you got into it.
Yeah. So I've always been fascinated with decision making from a personal perspective, simply because it was the only kind of self-help tool I could find that really worked. I think, therapy didn't quite work for me when I was younger, not in the best place I could have been in my life. And I just, it occurred to me that making better choices would lead to better opportunities, better options, which would lead to better choices. And so I just basically learned through trial and error how to decide myself out of a bad, my bad 20s, my really depressing 20s. And then ended up in graduate school at the University of Washington in sociology, and was just so lucky to have been pulled under the wing of some of the top theorists in rational choice theory in sociology, which is really just the practice of taking economic models of decision-making and applying them to sociology, or to explain sociological phenomenon. So we did a lot of work on like political movements and things like that. So that sort of married the academic, the really rigorous understanding of decision-making with my personal passion around really how decision science, we make decisions all the time that lead us nowhere, but like the science of decision making can actually lead us someplace good. And so for the past 15 or so, 20 years, I've been working in business, doing quite a bit of research on consumer decision making, consumer behavior. And now I'm senior director of decision science at a legal tech company called Clio. And I also do a lot of writing on my website, yournextdecision.com. I did teach decision science at the University of Washington. I don't do that anymore, but that's my story.
Okay. Well, what is it that makes you unique in your field?
I think it's the application of everything that I've learned to like my personal life, which sounds kind of squishy and kind of self-helpy. And, I know a lot of folks in business maybe don't want to go there in a business podcast, but there's something to be said about using yourself as a sort of guinea pig for your ideas, or to to understand like really through living how decision science can actually improve your decision-making, as opposed to just thinking about it theoretically or talking about it in terms of, what the research says and all that. But I found it's been really helpful especially in my company now, when I consult with people across the company on making better choices, that I can really get to the heart of the problem on their level, as opposed to keeping it like, lofty.
So since we're on it, and since I've got an audience of CEOs, I'm sure everybody wants to know, how do I improve my decision making, especially when I got over 200 cognitive biases I got to deal with?
Yeah. Well, I feel like there's one bias that seems to be the kind of gateway, or the gatekeeper, which is overconfidence bias. Like if you suffer from overconfidence bias, then you are really hopeless, because you're never going to be able to see all the other biases that are right behind that gate.
Right. The Lake Wobegon effect.
Yes. So, and it's really kind of tough to kind of overcome overconfidence bias, but the best way that I can think to do it is just to really walk around life all day. And this is why my personal experiences are so important, because I live this every day, just doubting yourself a little bit, like second guessing yourself, not your capability or your intelligence, but just the knowledge that you have, the information you have. Because really it comes down to, do I know everything I think I know? And how do I know that? Right. And the brain likes to move very quickly. It's very efficient. It likes to get to an answer at the expense of knowing everything. And that's kind of the problem.
So yeah, what do I know? What do I know that I know? What do I know that I don't know? And what are the unknown unknowns?
Right. Right.
And then what I teach is, what if I'm wrong?
Yeah,
You go through
exactly.
you go through your whole decision
Exactly.
analysis. And the last question is, all right, what if I'm totally wrong in everything I'm thinking about?
Right.
What are the what are the outcomes if I'm totally wrong?
Right. And so we both have legal backgrounds too, right?
Mhm.
And one thing I learned as when I was interning in law school in criminal defense, the public defender in King County in Seattle, I had a mentor who was very good at pushing me to take the opposing counsel's point of view, which I think a lot of good lawyers do.
That's right.
In order to prepare their case, you don't assume that you have a strong case and just go in.
How am I going to lose?
How am I going to lose? And it creates among, lawyers kind of a very risk averse, it kind of makes you a little bit of a curmudgeon, but honestly, it really does, that kind of approach really does ensure that your knowledge for whatever decision you have to make is airtight.
That's right. I mean, when I was a trial lawyer, civil trial lawyer for 22 years, and when I was preparing for trial, one of the things that I always asked myself and wrote out my strategy, what do I do if something happens in the courtroom that I'm completely unprepared for? Had no clue this was coming.
Yeah.
What do I do?
Right.
And then I would write down all my strategies. And that gave me a lot of confidence because I could walk into the courtroom and know that there really wasn't anything that could happen to me.
Yeah.
Feeling over my heart attack that I couldn't handle.
Exactly. I mean, I had the same experience. I used to compete in Muay Thai kickboxing, and it would be the same thing as you prepare for a match or a bout. You really have to think that way. Like you have to know who your opponent might be and what their style of fighting might be, and what if they did X, Y, or Z? How am I going to prepare for that? And you have to, you train so that when you're in the ring, it's just muscle memory where it just comes automatically. But that's all the winning comes in the training. The winning comes in the preparation. And I think CEOs kind of feel like the winning comes in the room when they're making the decision. It's not the decision making that makes or breaks the business. It's the preparation that goes into, and like we talked about a little bit before this podcast, the decision architecture, the choice architecture. Right. That's where it's at.
So you just found another touch point between the two of us. I'm a second-degree black belt in a northern Chinese.
Are you kidding? We have so much in common. It's nuts.
I'm a Tai Chi master and a second-degree black belt in a northern Chinese Kung Fu.
Yeah. Nice. Wow.
Yeah. So when you're giving advice to C-level people about how to improve their decision-making, so we've got the overconfidence bias we've got to deal with. Always doubt yourself. Always ask, what if I'm wrong? What processes do you find to be most effective when an executive has to lead a team through a decision-making process?
Yeah, so I think that there's I think I touched on this a little bit. There's this emphasis on the moment of decision-making that executives often kind of put a lot of weight on. And I think it's oftentimes when they do that, they kind of go with their gut too much.
I'm going to come back to that intuition.
It always comes back to that. It's like, okay, I have all this data. And by the way, I don't want to sound like negative anyway, but I do think a lot of C-level executives talk about being data-driven and they don't know what that means. Or they talk about relying on evidence when they make their decisions, but they really don't. Just because they amass a lot of numbers doesn't mean they're making data-driven decisions. Right. I think a lot of them surround themselves with numbers, and at the end, they just go with their instinct. And because there's just so much weight on that, like that decision-making moment. But it's the preparation, it's the choice architecture, it's understanding what outcome you want, as opposed to what options you have first. I think that's really a very key thing. What is your outcome rather than, well, what are the things we can do? Once you start brainstorming in the moment, you automatically, the brain is very short-term thinking. We delay the value of long-term rewards. We start muddling in the options and we start to kind of lose sight of that long-term objective. So I like to advise people to start with the objective and then ask, okay, under what conditions could this be possible?
Right.
And arrive at the options that way, working backwards, as opposed to trying to start with the option and then figuring out, okay, well, is this going to get to our outcome? I mean, it's much harder that way.
Right. I find that you choose your goals, look at your outcomes, and then make sure that whatever options or you choose as tactically or strategically to get that goal always disfavor the most favored outcome.
Exactly. Exactly.
Don't privilege it.
No.
Intuition.
Oh,
I'll just start with this and say, I think intuition is the worst way to make a decision unless it's backed up by critical thinking and a whole bunch of other data. But to rely on your gut to make an important decision is not a good thing. What do you?
I would never do it. I tell people that what your gut is telling you is a hypothesis.
That's right.
That there are many other hypotheses that you could validate or test with data that could be equally or more important than what your gut is telling you. The reason why I believe your gut or your instinct isn't really the way to go is because our gut and our instinct is really just a composite of all of our past experiences.
It's
really,
pattern recognition.
It's the availability heuristic plays a huge part too, where we only seem to think is what, we overweigh the importance of information that we easily remember. And our memories only remember things that are notable. And usually a lot of times it's the really boring, unmemorable data that is much more valuable in driving a decision. But we remember that one time we made that choice and we really hit it out of the park. And so we carry that memory, but we forget all these other, data points that could be equally important. Yeah. Right. It's just that too many CEOs don't agree with me or you, unfortunately.
So I teach, I teach my students, never ever rely on your intuition. It's okay to use your intuition. It's an important tool, but all it is advanced pattern recognition.
Yeah,
brains are able to see patterns. They find that's why we can see, princes are fairies in the clouds, right? Because really good at making patterns out of nothing. But what happens when the pattern looks like X and it's really Y?
And it's really Y. Or there's no pattern at all.
Or there's no pattern at all. So never, ever, ever just make a gut decision. It's the worst thing you can do. And I watch lawyers all the time in mediation come in and say, well, my gut tells me we should do this. And I just shake my head. No,
never. I think the only time I would ever use my instinct is if I was like at the gas station late at night and some weird guy starts walking up to me and stands too close to me. And then want to use your instinct.
Step back into a fighting stance and see.
That's happened to me before. And I was like, yeah, that was one of those times when it was probably a good idea. But yeah.
What I teach my students is it's okay to use intuition when the risk of being wrong is very low.
Yeah.
And you need to make a fast decision. You don't have a lot of time,
100%.
a lot of cognitive resources on it. And if you make a mistake, it's not going to kill you.
Reversibility is a big one. Yeah. If you make a mistake, can you take it? Can you take it back? Can you reverse it? That's and right. Yes. But it's really interesting is sometimes, and this is also something that I've noticed and I advise is that sometimes things seem like small, meaningless decisions at the very outset, but they have path dependency, right? They have a lock-in power where relationships are like this. Like you might just go on a few dates and then you just because you've been on a few dates, you go on a few more. And the next thing you know, you're married 10 years down the road and you're like, who is this person I'm living with? Like these little decisions sort of add up and lock you into this outcome. Right. And I see this happen in businesses all the time where these little seemingly innocuous decisions at the start made with your gut set you on this path. And the next thing you know, you don't have product market fit and you can't reverse it.
Right. I have made that mistake in my personal life before.
Yeah. Who has not? I mean, who has not really?
Exactly. So when you're working with your companies on consumer decision-making, how do you go about looking at consumer? It strikes me that consumer decision-making is going to be really an analysis of emotional decision-making.
It's an analysis of when decision-making is emotional.
Okay.
When decision-making relies on heuristics and when it relies on biases, which biases are at play given different circumstances. And then sometimes consumers do attempt rational decision-making. They're not good at it, but they do consider incentives in some situations.
Right.
So it's a combination of all of those. So a huge part of it, honestly, a huge part of consumer decision-making has to do with indecision and inertia, like getting them to break old behavior to make a different decision, to overcome action costs and change costs, to overcome that status quo bias and choice deferral and all of that. Like that is a big, because we're creatures of habit.
It's much easier to make the same decision we made every single time, because it's a much lower metabolic overload on the brain, then
Yeah.
it's to have to rethink it, reanalyze, reevaluate, and make
Right.
a new choice.
And anticipated regret is a real thing. People do worry about regretting the decision down the road. And so, loss aversion plays a role. You don't want to do something that's going to make you lose what you have because you value that too much. And there's so many other things.
So how do you go about modifying the decision-making behavior of consumers?
So it depends on the situation. So I've advised companies on, say, the design of their websites. And there are it's really about analyzing certain points where you want to reduce friction, but also create friction. Because when you create friction, you're forcing people to snap out of their habitual behavior, which might cause them to bounce off your site and really have to think about something, and which might increase the chances of them moving through your site. So in those situations, it's when do you want to increase or decrease friction? In marketing, it's all about, a lot of it is expressive utility might play a large role in marketing decision-making, marketing decisions. A lot of times consumers make decisions to purchase a product, not because the product is ideal or the best product for them, but because of what that purchase decision says about their personality, about their character. So marketers can actually tap, it kind of gets manipulative a little bit. I mean, I'm not going to lie, but they can tap into what is the identity that these consumers wish they had, and how can we tap into that? So it really just kind of depends. All of that stuff has a role. All of that stuff comes into play.
How do you, I want to cycle back to your life story, because it just struck me that, I mean, I know you went to law school and was I don't know, did you ever practice law?
Hated it. No, I hated, you know what? I blame my dad for making me finish law school. And I also thank him for making me finish law school. I knew right away I didn't like it.
So you got your JD, and then you went right back and started studying for your PhD?
I did not go right back. I actually worked in immigration law for like a year or two, as I was I was rallying to take the bar is what I was doing. I was trying to come on, Nika, you can do it. You can be a lawyer. And I at the last minute, I couldn't do it. It was just not for me. It was just not for me. And then for a couple of years, worked in marketing just because it was a job, floated around, and then went back to grad school because I realized the only classes I liked in law school were the sociology classes.
Yeah, what's interesting is I had never realized that in sociology, you can study rational choice theory and decision-making.
I didn't either, which was remarkable.
I mean, really interesting. Yeah, I would
game theory.
Really, I would expect all of that to be in economics or something.
Well, these really brilliant academics looked at the models that economists were using and said, well, shoot, maybe these models can help explain the spouses we choose.
Wow.
Maybe we're just, maybe they can explain why people would engage in high-risk protests or high-risk political behavior. How do people solve coordination problems or collaboration problems in order to engage in political movements? Just a very interesting, different kind of take. It's a very small, narrow field within sociology, but I thought very powerful and interesting. I was very lucky to work with these guys. Wow. Yeah. That's
neat. Well, you made it, it took me, I was a slow learner. It took me 22 years. Actually, I went back to school and got my master's degree in peace and conflict studies in the mid, and then I left the practice of law a couple of years after that to become a peacemaker. So,
is that why? Because there's no peace in law?
Very little.
Right.
I mean, I help more people in a day these days than I helped in 22 years as a trial lawyer. It was all about.
I believe it.
And so let's switch. This podcast is called Listening with Leaders. So I could talk about decision making all day long with you. But I'm really interested in your take, especially coming from the perspective that you do, of the importance of leaders listening in their decision making process.
Okay.
Reflect for me on that.
Well, first of all, I think a lot of us listen and we really don't listen. I think neuroscience research has showed us that this is the case, that our brains are simulation generating machines. They're constantly running predictive models, very sophisticated, right? And a lot of what we see or hear, perceive, or think we're experiencing in the world is just what we're predicting we're going to see. And I think recognizing that just because you heard something doesn't mean you heard it, or doesn't mean you got it, or doesn't mean you really understood it, that there is a very high likelihood that your brain is tricking you into seeing or perceiving or hearing somebody say something that either they didn't say or meant a different way, or that you put your spin on, that you interpret.
Your filters.
Your filter. It doesn't mean that you are flawed. It doesn't mean you're unintelligent. It doesn't mean that you aren't interested or driven or and have all the best intentions in the world. You're just human, and your brain is going to operate that way. And so when I interact with people and I'm not being, lazy or, trying to have fun, if I'm really seriously needing to talk to someone, I'm always wondering whether I'm hearing them. So I will listen, and then I will repeat, and I will ask again. Like, I try to get at it in 2 or 3 different ways, sort of triangulate. I feel like it's really just about gathering information. You're just trying to get data. And that's another thing I think a lot of people do. Maybe they could be doing differently or better when they listen, is that we try to gather information or patterns, right? See connections between things, because we want to arrive at what things mean. We want to create meaning, and then we want to decide. And we jump so quickly to decision that we don't listen with the intent of gathering information and seeing that as a discrete, separate exercise, distinct from the decision-making process.
Right.
And
so what I see is what you're describing is what I call early problem solving, early decision making, for one reason only: to soothe my own anxiety.
yes.
And so people will, rather than listen and reflect, and I think you touched on one of the ways of listening. So the way I teach this, it's reflective listening, and it's for words, meaning, and emotions. And each of those different types of listening is a different skill. So you can paraphrase for words, use what's known as core meaning, finding core meaning, reflecting core meaning for meaning, and affect labeling for emotions.
Right.
And usually you're going to combine all of those together. But the key the key to all of this is recognizing that, as you said, that your filters are going to get in the way.
Right.
And unless you get absolute clarity in the Prison and Peace Project, we teach our incarcerated students to, their best friends are Vera and Clara. Verify and clarify to really nasty neighbor misunderstood.
Right. Yeah.
And they get it.
Yeah.
There are very, very few people who really have strong listening skills. The other thing that I think is a problem is that our brains get distracted really easily. So somebody could say something to us and it creates an emotional trigger, or it creates another thought, a cascading awake. Associative cascades going on in our mind where memories are triggered, a thought sequences are good. Now we're chasing the rabbit down the rabbit hole, and we're not hearing anything what the other person is saying. So it's really, unless you're trained in this and trained to be a good listener, it's very, very hard to listen.
Absolutely. I mean,
I was going to say, what's remarkable to me is no one teaches you how to listen.
the only place I ever learned was in being trained to be a researcher.
There you go.
And the one most important thing that I keep in mind when I do my research is that I'm irrelevant in it. And I think that's very hard for people to want to believe, that when they're listening, they don't matter. And you don't. The person you're listening to matters.
That's right.
You're not relevant, and that's okay. It doesn't mean you're not an important person. It doesn't mean you don't have value in the world. It just means in that moment, it has nothing to do with you. So leave yourself out of it. Which
is why I teach, you're always reflecting from the speaker's frame of reference.
Mm-hmm.
So you never use an I statement when you're reflecting.
Right.
Always a you statement. Never use an I statement. You only use an I statement when you're talking about yourself. I'm angry.
Exactly. Right.
Otherwise, it's all you. Oh, you're really frustrated. You're really angry. You're pissed off. Whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And I just find that executives have a hard time with this.
And I kind of have some hypotheses why, but I don't really know why. I think it's partly cultural. I think it's partly lack of training. I think it's partly ego. I agree with you, all those. Yeah.
And I think that it's partly, since I'm at the top, I know better than everybody else.
Agreed.
And so it's rather than again, it goes back to what we were talking about before. What if I'm wrong?
Right.
Where am I making my mistakes? Especially trying to listen to somebody who has a value or a point or information that you really disagree with.
Right. I think in my experience, the, quote unquote executives that have that are much better at it, much better at listening, much better than being critical in their thinking or having being less likely to have overconfidence bias, are those that are newer to the game. Like when I work with startups and founders of startups, which I still do, they are so engaging. They're so interested because they're new and they are full of doubt. They have imposter syndrome. And that is such a beautiful place to be, because they are soaking in everything, not just from me, but from everything. Once they get on that path, especially if they're successful, then the fundamental attribution kicks in. Oh, I was successful. It had to be about me. I'm so awesome. Nothing I can do is wrong. And then they start.
Well, it was that venture capital guy who came in and screwed me up.
Right. Exactly. If it didn't go right, it's not my fault. If it went well, it's all me. Yeah. Never mind that I have a team of brilliant people beneath me.
Right.
But yeah, it's that startup mentality, not the startup business structure. Like that needs to change as the business grows. You can't work, you have to have some systems to accommodate larger groups, but like that, I don't really know what I'm doing. I am really kind of struggling. That's got to be part of your DNA.
Exactly. All right. Well, we're at the end of the 30 minutes. I could talk to you for hours, obviously.
I know, me too.
but I want to cut it short so that we don't bore everybody to death.
Yeah, sure.
One last question, a personal question.
Sure.
What's one thing that we wouldn't know about you unless you revealed it to us?
Oh, I don't know. I'm kind of an open book.
It could be an interest. It could be a hobby. It could
be
a place you've been. It could be.
I mean, is it? I like heavy metal.
There you go.
I listen to punk rock and I like to listen to heavy metal. Yeah.
That makes sense coming out of Seattle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm a jazz violinist, so there you go.
Oh, well, there you go. Well, I'll forgive you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Nika.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed the conversation.
Same.